Thank you very much. Yeah, just if there is something with the slides or if you don't hear well, just write in the chat or let me know. Cool. Yeah, so as Doran said, I'm also a visiting scholar at UCD. I did my PhD in social psychology from the University of Lausanne in Switzerland. And actually, I studied political science before that. So I had a bachelor in political science. So I'm really happy also to also have a bit contact with people from other fields here. And yeah, today I will present some of the work that I've been doing where I'm really interested in the interplay between social norms and social change, and to understand also social change processes. So, good. So we know that, I mean, as we all know, societies are changing a lot. For example, recently in Switzerland, we legalized same-sex marriage via public referendum actually 2 months ago. There are also like other issues that are happening all over the world. Or in Ireland, they legalized, for example, same-sex marriage in 2015, I think. So there are a lot of things changing in the world, as you all know. And for me, I'm super interested in understanding why things are changing, and also how people are impacted by the social change process. But not only how they're impacted, but also how they actually change things. And a key part of my work is that I think that when we are looking at the interaction between the social context and individuals, we are sometimes missing one core element, which is that people, for example, if they're thinking about people, other people around them, they don't necessarily know what is actually happening in their head. They can only rely on perceptions. And I think that one way to really try to understand how in the social change process is to also look at how people perceive things, especially how they perceive the social context. And today I will really present a set of studies where I look at how perceived norms, which in my case is the perception that people have of most people's opinions in a society, for example. And I will show example a bit later. And I'm really looking at how these perceived norms interact with the social context and how people perceive things around them. As I said before, I'm interested really in how the social context interacts with individual. That could be a way that we perceive a bit social change processes with time. And I really want to look at how perceptions that we have can explain part of these processes. And today I will present a set of studies where I always try to look at the interaction between different of these levels. In the first study, I will try to look how people just perceive others' opinions or perceive the situation towards different issue. Here in this case, towards LGBTIQ issues. And I also look at how this perception can be dependent on the context, on the social context. And for that, I will present a quasi-representative study that I conducted in Switzerland. Then I will present some studies where I looked at how these perceptions that I measured affect the way people engage in social movements to change, for example, the legal situation. And there I will present some study in the sexual minority context. When I say sexual minority, it means, for example, lesbian, gay, or bisexual people, so people who have a minority sexual orientation. And then I represent a set of studies. First, a study where I want to look at how changes in the legal situation impact perceptions that people have of the norm. And there I will use a natural experiment that I conducted in Switzerland. And finally, I will present a study where I go one step further to see how actually a public referendum changes perceptions that people have of their society and how this impacts their well-being. And there it's a two-way longitudinal study where I look at before and after a referendum. And as I said before, all these studies, they have been conducted in Switzerland. And don't worry, I know we're not in 2020 anymore. I wanted to tell you a bit more about the legal situation in Switzerland right now around LGBTIQ issues. So in 2020, same-sex marriage, joint adoption, and assisted procreation for same-sex partners were not legal. And we have same-sex partnerships since 2006, stepchild adoption for same-sex partners since 2018, and protection from discrimination based on sexual orientation since 2020. And we have since this year, 2 months ago, I mean, it's not yet implemented, but people voted in favor of same-sex marriage and all these issues. So what you can see is that, well, a lot of things have been changing in Switzerland right now around LGBTIQ issues, and that's why I think it's, for me at least, an interesting context, because I can really look at social change processes when really things are happening quite fast, and also there are really changes in the legal situation, which I can also look at. So as I said before, the first study was quite simple. I just wanted to know how people perceive attitudes towards LGBTIQ issues. And when I started this study, which was when I started my PhD in 2015, actually, I thought, well, we can see in a lot of Western countries that people are getting more and more tolerant towards LGBTIQ issues. And these changes have been quite fast in comparison to other groups. And I thought, well, what about perceptions? Because I thought back in the days that maybe, well, things have been changing very fast, and it's possible that we don't necessarily perceive it. So for example, in 2015, we were not really discussing about same-sex marriage in Switzerland, but I thought, well, maybe we all think that that the society is not ready for it, but maybe we're wrong and people are actually quite ready. And that's what I wanted to investigate. And when we talk in social psychology about this mismatch between what the situation is, how we perceive it, between what the situation is and how we perceive it, we're talking about pluralistic ignorance too, which is basically when we misperceive others' opinions in a society. And we also say that pluralistic ignorance can stem from two general constructs. The first one is false consensus. So it's this idea that some people may think that others share their opinion, but it's actually not the case. And some studies show that right-wing people or conservative people are more likely to think that way. And then the opposite effect, which can also lead to just a misperception of others' opinions, is false uniqueness. It's when people think that they have a unique opinion that is not shared by the majority of people in the society, but that they're actually wrong because their opinion is quite shared. And there are also some studies that show that liberal or left-wing people are more likely to do false uniqueness. So that's what I wanted to test. I wanted to look at pluralistic ignorance and also look at whether people with different political orientation have different perceptions. And I did this study in Switzerland at the end of 2016. And there, you probably all know that if I want to look at how people perceive others' opinions and compare them with what the actual opinions in the society is, I need to try to get a representative sample of the population so that I can really compare both. And so to do that, and I didn't have a ton of funding, so I had to find a specific way. And one way is that I focused on one state in Switzerland, this one actually, this is Switzerland. And I decided to do my study on this one. And to try to get a quasi-representative sample, I used this technique, which first I used multi-stage sampling, where I selected 30 municipalities in this state. And I organized these municipalities by strata. So I thought, well, there might be a lot of differences between urban, rural, and peri-urban areas. So I decided to pick municipalities in each of these three groups, randomly pick them. And then to select participants, I used what we call the random root method. So basically, it's very simple. This is an example of one municipality. I randomly selected 2 addresses. They are the point in orange. And then I walked randomly in the streets and distributed questionnaires in the letterbox. And I distributed 3,600 questionnaires. It took quite some time. but it actually worked quite well. About 37% of people sent back the questionnaire. So I had 830 valid answers, and it was quite well distributed in terms of, in comparison to the population characteristic in the state. So in terms of gender and also political orientation. And these people, they had a large question. No, the questionnaire was quite short, but it was presented as a questionnaire on family forms. So they had a lot of different questions, but there were also questions that were interesting for me for this project, which were questions about how people, the personal opinions of people and how they perceive the opinions of most residents towards these three issues. And the idea was then to look at their answer and to see if the perceptions and the opinions match or if they don't match. So what did I find? Here you can find in this table the average mean of opinions for all the three issues. Higher, it goes from 1 to 5. 5 means really in disapproval, and 1 means total in approval. So we see that people were more in approval of same-sex marriage than parenting. And we see that actually already then in 2015, most people were quite in favor of same-sex marriage. But then when we compare with perceptions that people have, we see that people always perceived more disapproval in the population than what it actually was. So there was a form of overestimation of the level of disapproval. And when we compare, if you remember this idea of false consensus, false uniqueness, when we look at the distribution among different political orientation, we see here the level of disapproval. In orange is the perceptions that people have, and in blue-green, the personal opinions. And what we see is that actually the perceptions were super stable. Everyone kind of assumed that people were not very tolerant towards these issues. And of course, the opinions were varying a lot. So we can see that liberal people were the ones who were really far away from, well, we really perceived that the opinions were really far from their actual opinions. So what I found then is that it seems to be kind of a pluralistic ignorance, at least a mismatch between perceptions and actual opinions, and also these forms of false consensus and false uniqueness. And what I thought is that, well, maybe it's just that, well, opinions are changing and we don't necessarily directly see that. And so sometimes it takes time for norms to perception to update. And I'm also going to talk about that later on. But also what I thought is, okay, people seem to really perceive disapproval in the population. And I thought, well, why should it matter, right? Because maybe it's not that important. And so one study that I did was to look at, do these perceptions affect the way people are going to engage in social movements, or do these perceptions affect the way the social change process goes? And that was a set of studies that I did with some colleagues here. And yeah, so here I'm talking about collective action, but it's quite similar to engagement in social movements, for example. And in this study, I just wanted to know how perceptions impact collective action. And I'm building most of my hypothesis on a model, social psychology model of collective action, which is the social identity model of collective action. And in this model is the idea that people are going to engage when they highly identify with a group, so for example, with LGBTIQ people, and that the impact of identification on collective action is also mediated by two processes, at least. One is the perceived efficacy of a movement. So if we think the movement will be efficient, people are going to engage. And the other one is emotions that you might feel, for example, anger towards the legal situation. And I use this model to try to think a bit what would happen if we would try to add perceived norms in the model. And one first thing is that, quite logical, I think, if we for example, perceive that people are intolerant towards LGBTIQ issues or same-sex marriage, then we might be less likely to engage because we think it's not the right time to do something. The efficacy will not work. But on the other hand, it would also motivate people because they actually think there is a need for a social movement to change the legal situation. It's not changing naturally. And also that people are maybe angry at the situation and they want to do something. And here, this model that I'm showing, it's focusing on people who are likely to engage in favor of LGBTIQ issues. So it's a model for allies or sexual minority or LGBTIQ people themselves. And this was the model, just so you have an idea, that I wanted to test. And these studies, we pre-registered them, so we put all the hypotheses and everything online before we collected the data. And we collected data as part of the Swiss LGBTIQ panel, which is a project that I started with Tabea Hessler, who is also going to present for this seminar. And we are actually in the Swiss LGBTIQ panel, we are following LGBTIQ people over time. And the idea is to also see how changes in the legal situation impact them. And here I'm using 3 studies that are from the panel. So for the first study, it was in 2019, and we just used a cross-sectional design. So we used data collected at one time point, and we measured in the questionnaire different things, but our outcome was the way people intend to engage in collective action. So for example, attend a demonstration, sign a petition, or different behaviors that they could have. So we asked them how much they intend to do that to improve the legal situation of LGBTIQ people. And we had, in this case, 1,220 sexual minorities who filled in the questionnaire. And we also had measures of all the relevant constructs, so we could test our model with a structure equation model and see how perceived norms impact collective action intention. And what we found is exactly what we were expecting. That means, on the one hand, we found that perceiving that people were intolerant was likely to make that people would be less likely to engage in the future because they perceived that it was not the right moment to engage. But at the same time, it was also encouraging them to engage because they perceived that there was really a need for a movement. So overall, this perception of the majority opinion really had a conflicting effect. So it had at the same time discouraging, encouraging. And we replicated this in 2020 with similar data. And you might already think that, well, this is interesting, but we are only looking at intention. So of course we don't know what people actually do. And that's what we also thought. So we tried to assess actual engagement in collective action. And there we used also part of the panel data where we collected data 1 month before and 1 month after a public referendum on protecting sexual minorities against discrimination. And the same people participated before and after the referendum. And there we actually asked them after the referendum whether they engage in different types of behaviors during the campaign in favor of the referendum. So for example, some people distributed flyers and others put posters, or people talked to other people. So there were different things that they did during the campaign, and we tried to assess them after the campaign and ask people what they actually did. And then we use this as an outcome to look at how perceived norms and other constructs impact the behaviors that they reported. And here we found exactly, again, very similar processes. It means that there was a conflicting effect of perceptions of the majority opinion, because at the same time it had a clear, actually direct negative effect on whether people would engage in or not during the campaign. And on the other hand, it also had an impact on this situation. So again, here a conflicting effect. And so basically what we found, it was that at the same time was discouraging and encouraging people. And so in our cases, it was quite balanced. The two effects would cancel each other out. But what we would like to do in the future is to also look at when these effects might not balance each other out. So, for example, it might be that in some cases, if we perceive the majority opinion to be really, really intolerant, that we're not going to engage, for example. And so that's something that we would like to also look at in the future. Now, a next step, and that's what I already talked about, is, for example, what happens when collective action is successful. So, for example, in the case of the referendum, when a new law is, or it was not a law, it was a change actually in the penal code, but when this is implemented, or when people vote in favor of this law change, what happens? And especially there, we were interested in knowing, well, since people seem to overestimate the level of intolerance towards at least sexual minority issues in Switzerland, what happens if if there is a change in the legal situation? Does it help people to update their perceptions? And for that, I will present two studies. The first one, here it was a study where we looked at a new law on stepchild adoption. And again, we were interested in, well, this new law. What was special about it is that there was no referendum. So in Switzerland, you can, sometimes there is when there is a change in the law and it's coming from the government, there will be an optional referendum. So if people gather enough signature against the law change, there will be a vote. If they don't, then the thing is directly implemented, or there is no vote at least. And that's what happened in this case with the law on stepchild adoption. And so it was interesting then in my case, because I could really look at how institutional decisions, without going through the public vote, how does this shape perception? And what I thought would be interesting is that this new law, there was not a lot of media coverage. So we thought, well, maybe not a lot of people know about the law change. So it will be interesting to know how informing people about the law impacts their perceptions. And we actually used this as an experimental design, where we had actually two versions of the same questionnaire, or not the same, but very similar questionnaire. The only difference is that in one version of the questionnaire, we told people about the new law, and we told them that it had just been implemented, and we asked them if they already heard about it before or not. And then after this question, we asked them about how they perceive the opinions of others in the population, and then also about their opinions, their personal opinions. And in the other condition, this question was presented at the very end. So they first gave us their perceptions and opinions towards the issues, and then we told them about the new law and asked them if they already knew about it. What we expected is that among the people who say that they never heard about the law, they had never heard about the law, and we expected that informing them about it would make that they would perceive less tolerance towards especially same-sex parenting than the people who who say they didn't hear about the law, but they also only get this information at the very end of the questionnaire, so it didn't impact the answer. And there we used a sample of students at the university, and again, half of them got the first version of the questionnaire, and the other half the second version of the questionnaire. I mean, it was one random. And what did we find? We found what I was talking about here in the graph. We see the perception of the disapproval in Switzerland towards same-sex female parenting. On the left side, we see people who say they never heard about the law before. On the right side, we see the people who say they already heard about it. And in orange, we see the people who got the control condition, so they didn't get the information directly about the law. And in blue, the one who got the information. So what we see is that among the people who already knew about the law, there is no real effect when we inform them or not. But among the people who didn't know about it, we see that informing them about the law makes that they perceive less disapproval here towards same-sex female parenting. And we found the same for same-sex male parenting. So what does it mean? It means that it seems like, which is quite logical, I guess, is that when there are new changes in the legal situation, they don't only offer new protection or a new rights to groups or these kind of things, but they also shift in a way the perception that people have of the majority opinion, because it's an indicator often of how the society stands towards different issues. And in this final study, I wanted to go one step further again and ask myself, why does it matter? And there I really wanted to know how these changes or changes in the legal situation or these kind of things impact perception, but also the well-being of people who are targeted by or concerned by the law. And this is an ongoing project where we use the same data before and after the referendum on protecting sexual minorities against discrimination, where I don't think I mentioned it, but 63.1% of people voted in favor of this change. And I wanted to know how people were impacted by it. So what we thought when we started the project, again, is that the referendum in this case will probably serve as a signal of support, of public support towards the issue. So it might have actually shifted the perceived norms, which is what we already found without the referendum, but with the legal changes. And I thought that actually this change in perceived norm might also impact the well-being of sexual minorities. So for example, if the law passes, then people perceive a more tolerant opinion and they also might report a more positive well-being. And here we use the same data that I mentioned before with the collective action. So it was data collected before and after the referendum with colleagues, with Leila Eisner again and colleagues from Australia. And here we had, for people who participated in the relevant answer to the items that we're using here, about 419 sexual minorities that we use, quite mostly young sample, but still also older people, about half of women, and then distribution of men and non-binary people, majority of homosexual people, and most people from the German-speaking part of Switzerland, which is also the biggest part of Switzerland. And these people, so in the questionnaire, they had to tell us about the perception of the majority opinion in Switzerland towards different sexual minority issues. And we also asked them their well-being in the past months, positive and negative emotions, and also a bunch of additional control variables. So all these items, they were measured both before the referendum and after the referendum among the same people. So we could look at first at changes in perception of the majority opinion, perceived norms, and we found what we were expected, which is people perceive the more tolerant norm after the referendum compared to before. But what we didn't expect actually is that the effect was quite different to when, for example, there was the new law on stepchild adoption, because a new law is just telling people something has changed, so it's a clear signal, while a referendum, it's actually a proportion, right? So you have the proportion of people who vote in favor of the law change, but you also have the people who vote against it. And this proportion also impacts the people. And here, what I wanted to show you is the rain cloud plot, where we see here the perception of the norm before the referendum and after the referendum. And sorry, in this case, it's a perception of tolerant norm, so it's the opposite than for the other graphs. And we have the lines that connect the same people. And what we see here is that in orange is after the referendum, the perception become more tolerant, indeed, what I said before. But we also see that it's not only that they become more tolerant, they also converge towards one point. We see that the distribution is more, there's much less variation in answer after the referendum. So somehow the people who perceived a quite tolerant norm before the referendum, they tended to actually update the perception and be a bit less optimistic. And the ones who were perceiving really intolerance, they also were more likely to, on the other hand, perceive a more tolerant norm after the referendum. So it looks like changes in perceived, well, the referendum, it has kind of an effect of making that answers converge towards one point rather than just going in one direction or another. So it converges toward this point actually. Now the second thing we looked at is whether the referendum impacted the well-being of the people, so whether well-being changed before and after the referendum, and there was no actually overall change. And when we looked more in details into the model, it looked like that actually it was more that there were a lot of changes between people. So some people reported more positive, some more negative, and some did not change. So we still looked at how the change in norm was impacted with this change in well-being, because people still change even though the overall level didn't change. And what we found, and was very stable, is that the change in well-being was associated with the change in norm. That means that people who perceived a more tolerant norm after the referendum compared to before, they also were more likely to report a more positive well-being. And this was also even after accounting for COVID-19 and a lot of other covariates. And here I was talking about positive well-being, so people, this referendum is linked to that. But then when we looked at the negative well-being, we see that the perceived norms don't impact it, and then there was a huge impact of COVID-19. So now to finish on this study is that we see that I think that perception of the majority opinion, I mean, especially when it's a democratic process, so a referendum, they do have an impact. I mean, a referendum is also telling people what is the majority opinion of people who are voting, of course, citizens, but also the ones who participate, but it's still a clear indicator. And then actually the outcome of a referendum seems to, I mean, it actually depends, well, the outcome of the referendum seems to increase consensus in the perception, so people they seem to tend towards one perception if that is depending on the outcome, the proportion of people who vote in favor or against a referendum. At least in this case, it will be interesting to look at other issues if we find something similar. And here we are collecting with another colleague, we collected very similar data around the referendum on pro-environmental behaviors, and there we'll see if we find similar processes. And also what we see is that it seems really that the change in perceived norm was really also associated with changes in well-being. What we are doing now too is to look at, we have similar data before and after the marriage equality postal survey in Australia, and so we can look if we can replicate the findings, and there we can also, they have a big sample of allies and opponents, so we'll be able to also look at how the processes might differ depending on whether people support or not the issues. And now to finish, I just wanted to also mention another project that we are currently running, which is a bit of follow-up of this one. I already said there was a referendum, and of course this is a great opportunity to also look at how it impacts people. And in Switzerland, 64% of people voted in favor of marriage, same-sex marriage, which is quite similar to Ireland in 2015 actually. And what is, I think, we didn't expect that, and it's really interesting, is that all states voted in favor of the law of same-sex marriage, which was really not expected because there are some states that are very conservative. So, for example, one was the last one to legalize to give women the right to vote, and it was in 1990, so it was really not that long ago. And it was unexpected that they also voted in favor of this. So it will be really cool to see how it's impacting people from also different states, because in our panel, for example, with Tabea, we have people from all the states, so we'll be able to look at that. And in these studies, we are interested to look at the impact of the outcome of the referendum, but also the impact of the campaign on people. And there, because we wanted to go one step further on understanding how it's impacting people, we thought that it would be interesting to not only look at self-reported measures in question and data, but also have biological data. And there we are looking at cortisol levels or stress levels, that we can look at them, how they change during the campaign around same-sex marriage, but also after the referendum. And we are currently doing this longitudinal study where we have 3 time points, where we are following LGBTIQ people and also cisgender heterosexual people to look at how they were impacted. And these people, they both actually provide us with some samples of their hair that they sent by post, and also they provide self-reported data. When we started the project, so the first wave was before the campaign and before the referendum, more as a control wave. We had 560 people who would send us their hair, and then much more who did the survey questionnaire. So the people who sent their hair, they also did the questionnaire too. And then we did the same study again right before the vote. So it was the week before the vote. And these are the people who continued participating. And now we are preparing the final wave after the vote, where we'll be able to also then have all our data. And yeah, this project is also with Tabea Hessler and also other colleagues from Zurich and also from Canada. Good. And now to quickly finish, to wrap up, just to recap what I presented today. I had this first study where I found that people seem to overestimate the level of intolerance. Then in the second study, I looked at how this impacts the social change process actually, and I found that it had a conflicting impact on engagement in social movements. Then I looked also at how this once change happen, how it impacts perceptions, and they do help in a way to adjust perception. And finally, I'm looking at how this change impacts also the well-being of people who are concerned by the social change process. And I also found this. And now to quickly finish, I also wanted to mention that for us, and I think especially with the work with the Swiss LGBTIQ panel, we're really interested in also giving back what we find to the population and also people who are interested in our findings. So we're doing a lot of outreach, which I think is also what helps us to keep participants and make that people also start joining our project. And if you're interested a bit more about what's the situation like of, for example, LGBTIQ people in Switzerland or in different contexts, you can look at our reports where we mention a bit the key statistics. Cool. And now I wanted to just finish by thanking also all the other people, and there are many more other people who helped us during this project, and also of course UCD and all the people who made this possible, including Laura, who really helped us coming to Dublin and also helped us with everything.